Hello Zero Books readers. In this video, we'll consider Matthew McManus' argument that postmodernism is a conservative philosophy while touching on Mark Fisher's books Capitalist Realism and Ghosts of My Life, all while revisiting the 1991 Richard Linklater film Slacker.
That no one in their right mind would touch him with a 10-foot pole, with a 6-foot pole, with a 6-inch pole, well maybe a 6-inch. That's a disturbed young man with a tan. And problems so deep.
When I first saw Richard Linklater's movie Slacker back in 1991, I not only identified with the characters on screen, but wanted to emulate them. I was a 20-year-old college dropout with literary aspirations, a studio apartment, and a shitty job going door to door for PIRG, a public interest research group. Linklater's Slacker seemed to sum up a sensibility that I didn't yet know enough to call surrealist, but that I would try to reproduce in a zine I started called Diet Soap, and in various short stories that I wrote throughout that decade. In fact, I was so taken by the film that I noticed some of the small details. For instance, I noted that the purple book that the kid puts in his backpack in this scene is entitled The Anti-Aesthetic Essays on Postmodern Culture, and I made sure to procure a copy for myself. Back in 1984, before she wrote an essay for the Journal of Higher Education that would get her investigated for a possible Title IX violation, that is, before she became relatively famous, Professor Laura Kipnis reviewed Foster's collection for the Minnesota Review. She summed it up this way: Hal Foster's introduction delineates and disentangles two primary strands of postmodernism, a postmodernism of resistance and a postmodernism of reaction. From the beginning, then, it was possible to argue that postmodernism included a conservative tendency. What I would argue today is that both aspects of postmodernism, both strands, are conservative. By reducing any critique of capitalism to the level of resistance, postmodernism, despite pretending to radicalism, assists and acts out what isn't just a strand, but really a reactionary core. And some of the essays in the anti-aesthetic would support my conclusion. Jürgen Habermas, for instance, in his essay Modernity, an Incomplete Project, noted that, quote, the neoconservative does not uncover the economic or social causes for the altered attitudes he so disdains. And the same can be said of postmodern critics of modernity as well. While the neoconservative points to dissonance and deviance to explain the consequences of capitalist modernity, postmodern radicals blame those people and institutions who defend traditional values for the sexism, racism, and homophobia that not only exists, but serve systemic functions.
And now, here's Tommy!
It was so cold. 42 degrees.
In an essay entitled Postmodernism and Consumer Society, Frederick Jameson argued that the difference between modernity and postmodernity is the same as the difference between parody and pastiche.
Do I look as bad as Ed Sullivan? I mean...
According to Jameson, A parody like this clip of Tommy Smothers imitating Johnny Carson, despite being born out of an obvious admiration for Johnny, quote, casts ridicule on the private nature of his stylistic mannerisms and their excessiveness with respect to the way people normally speak or behave. Whereas a pastiche, for instance, this excerpt from Madonna's video for her hit Material Girl, merely imitates the style of Marilyn Monroe, borrowing her appeal and look and using these as a kind of mask. Madonna isn't commenting on the specificity of Monroe or the excesses of Monroe's particular subjectivity, but is merely inhabiting the cultural space that Marilyn Monroe once occupied. Jameson, criticizing the movie Body Heat in a way that I think applies equally to Madonna's video, wrote, quote, "It seems to me exceedingly symptomatic to find the style of nostalgia films invading and colonizing even those movies which have contemporary settings, as though, for some reason, we are unable to focus on our own present, as though we have become incapable of achieving aesthetic representations of our own current experience." Now, if all this sounds familiar to you, it should, because Jameson's critique of postmodern culture was later renamed by Mark Fisher. Fisher wrote, quote, "What I'm calling capitalist realism can be subsumed under the rubric of postmodernism as theorized by Jameson." And Fisher's observations about nostalgia and Ghosts of My Life clearly also owes something to Jameson.
Hi everybody, this is Matt McManus again. I'm here to talk about our book, What is Postmodern Conservatism? Essays for Hugely Tremendous Times, which is out for 0 books later this year. I think that a lot of people misunderstood how truly debilitating the sense that we had reached the end of history in Francis Fukuyama's thesis actually was for many. There's the sense that, well, everything major had been accomplished, and if we don't know who we are and we don't know what it is that we're supposed to do, then in some senses that's just something we're going to have to learn to live with. We're going to have to acclimate ourselves to that in much the same way as we're just going to have to acclimate ourselves to various forms of capitalist realism.
Come on, I'm asking you, is that right? Oh, that's sweet.
I mean, in a certain way, one of the characteristics of what the self is, and one of the reasons it's under siege, is we're interpretive beings. And now, by the late 20th century, we're in a situation where interpretation has never been more difficult. Never been more difficult. I can name artifacts that we've developed technologically that are almost completely closed to interpretation, and I'll name one, although we attempt to interpret it. Television. Television tries to interpret itself to us, bypassing the upper brain functions and directly feeding into our minds. This is why I said off camera between classes that Orwell was a pie-eyed optimist. 1984 arrived in sort of the early 70s, and Orwell's vision of a horrible future, which was a boot stomping on a human face forever, is a utopian image because he assumed there would be resistance and human faces, both of which may turn out to be false. So, 1984 is not a book that scares me anymore.
If Roderick's right, if Orwell really was a pie-eyed optimist, one reason might be because Orwell's conception of human subjectivity, and ours too, was a product of the Enlightenment, and then, after that, of modernity. If we really are living in an epoch that comes after modernity, then it only makes sense that the human subject has passed away. In Foster's book, Jameson says, quote, "There are in fact 2 positions on all this, one of which is more radical than the other. The first one is content to say, yes, once upon a time, in the age of competitive capitalism, in the heyday of the nuclear family, and the emergence of the bourgeoisie as the hegemonic social class, there was such a thing as individualism. as individual subjects. But today, in the age of corporate capitalism, of the so-called organization man, of bureaucracies in business as well as in the state, of demographic explosion, today, that older bourgeois individual subject no longer exists. Then there is a second position, the more radical of the two, what one might call the post-structuralist position. Not only is the bourgeois individual subject a thing of the past, it is also a myth. There have never been autonomous subjects of that type. Rather, this construct is merely a philosophical and cultural mystification which sought to persuade people that they had individual subjectivity and possessed a unique personal identity. I think this second critique returns us to the movie Slacker, and it might help explain why I identified with the movie when I first saw it, even though the film did not offer up any particular character, nothing in the way of a protagonist with whom I might identify. The film is not in any way nostalgic, or at least it wasn't when it came out. Rather, as a media response to Slacker indicated, Linklater created an aesthetic representation of what was then the present. When I saw this little movie in 1991, I imagined that I was a part of what was maybe a collective subjectivity. I imagined myself to be part of a community of young people who were, however lackadaisically, attempting to make progress towards autonomy and individuality, to develop a critique, and to create meaning out of the late 20th century. Looking back at the movie today, I would say that it was full of mystifications and mistakes. Rather than find a way to create a new society, we imagined that there was a secret society and a cult reality already at work in the world. A counterculture was already operating, already struggling to be born, and the task was to help it along, even though I couldn't see all the moving parts, and even if I didn't understand where it or I was going. If the old postmodernity of the 90s was ideological, if it was a moment of false consciousness, and if today I can see that Jameson's critique remains at the level of appearance, and if I can understand that Habermas is really an apologist for liberal democratic capitalism, this is only possible because of my own postmodern turn back in the early 90s. Let's grant McManus's premise. Let's say that postmodernism is a conservative philosophy, that it is a philosophy born out of stasis. If we can realize this, if we can collectively understand that modernity is an unfinished project, as Habermas wrote, can't we also agree that human subjectivity hasn't quite fully passed away from the world? If we can see that capitalist realism is an ideology, can't we also see that, at least in theory, we've already surpassed it? Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.